Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Anna, and I will be your host for this evening's webinar. Today, we're going to be talking all about understanding early college application deadlines. If you're a student who is confused about what college application deadlines exist, when you should be applying, you are absolutely in the right place. My speakers today, Christopher and Meredith, will be sharing a ton of information that families need to know before they really dive deep into the process. So as more people start to trickle in, I'd love for all of you to start popping into the chat where you're located from. And while we do that, I am also going to be launching our first poll of the evening. So this is a get to know you poll. I'd love to learn a little bit more about who's in our audience today. So up on the screen, you should see a list of questions. So if you're a parent or guardian or a student, feel free to start answering some of the questions that you have up there. Awesome. So tons of people from 11th grade, which is great. You're definitely thinking ahead, and this is the right time to start thinking. And let's take a look at the chat. So we have people joining us from California, from Florida, Maryland. Meredith, where are you joining us from today?
Oh, I'm in Columbus, Ohio.
And Christopher, where are you joining us from?
I am in Los Angeles, and I'm saying it in this voice because, Anna, you work very closely with Nama, who insists on saying I live in Pasadena. I do not live in Pasadena. My mail says City of Los Angeles. I bought this house in the City of Los Angeles. I was adamant about the fact that this house would be in the City of Los Angeles proper.
Wonderful. So Christopher is in Los Angeles. Meredith will be sharing more information about her situation currently with some weather watch that we have going on tonight. But as always, let's move on to the next slide. And feel free to still be popping your location into the chat. For those of you who are joining a CollegeWise webinar for the first time, and I do see a lot of new faces in the audience, or names, I shall say, CollegeWise started in 1999, and what really drives the work that we do every single day is to create a stress-free experience for students. So if you've been on a webinar with our founder, Kevin McMullen, you've heard him say this many times, but the college application process is unnecessarily complex. And what we strive to do with our students is to really simplify the experience and make it more enjoyable for families. So for students, rather than spending senior year worrying about all the complexities of college application deadlines or what you need to add to your application, does this look good? We really take all that away with the expertise of our incredible counselors. So we've helped over 26,000 students navigate the process, and CollegeWise was actually ranked the #1 undergraduate college counseling firm in 2023. So it's really a testament to the incredible work we've done with families over the many years that we've been operating. And as always, we're really excited to see the next wave of students and to support them through the process as well. So that's a little bit about CollegeWise. Let's head on to the next slide and do some quick housekeeping. So very quickly, as you may have noticed, this session is being recorded, and all of you will receive a copy of the recording via email in the next 24 to 48 hours. Additionally, we will be conducting our live Q&A at the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions for me or for our speakers, please pop those into the Q&A tab that is located at the bottom of your screen. We do want to keep the chat free of any questions. This gives us an opportunity to really sift through and see what questions have yet to be answered. And then finally, the function that we will not be using today is the raise hand function. So again, if you have comments, please pop them into the chat, and questions will go into the Q&A as well. So that is the most talking you'll hear from me this evening. Let's head on to the next slide, and I will introduce our first speaker, Meredith, to all of you.
Thank you, Anna, very much. And as Anna alluded, for those of you who are on the very start of the call, I'm based in Columbus, Ohio. We are having quite a spectacular weather evening right now. So if I happen to disappear, it's because either I've lost power or internet, or because the tornado sirens have gone off. just outside my place, and I need to step away and go somewhere safer. It's been a very entertaining weather day here. So other than that, though, I have been with CollegeWise now since I'm in my 11th year here. I joined CollegeWise in the summer of 2013. I originally started in Greater Boston. I opened one of the CollegeWise offices out there, and then I moved back here to Ohio to be closer to my family. But overall, I've had more than 25 years in the industry. I worked at 4 different universities, spent a lot of time working with students across the spectrum through the entire journey to college. And one of the things that I know from this experience is making smart choices around the colleges you apply to and the timelines that you're applying on, which is a lot of what we're going to be talking about tonight, can really make the process a lot less stressful if you are approaching it very thoughtfully. And so we're going to be spending a lot of time talking about a lot of different information tonight, but we're very glad you're here. And I'm going to pass it over to Christopher.
Hello, everybody. I'm Christopher Logan. I'm along with Meredith, one of the CollegeWise Master Counselors. And Meredith did mention this, but she and I actually sit together as the leaders and sort of the guiding lights for the CollegeWise Thought Leadership Committee. We've both been doing a lot of the research and writing for the company on trends in the industry, trends in college admissions, trends in the marketplace. I wrote the paper that was published last year about the affirmative action decision sorry, I should clarify that. The Supreme Court decision about the consideration of race in college admissions. I will point out that it is not actually a decision about affirmative action. I also wrote the paper that is relevant to today's conversation about the different admissions deadlines and the different strategies for admissions based on those deadlines. I, as you can probably tell, am a massive nerd. You can see my Dungeons and Dragons set up behind me. Data is my guiding light. I love numbers in so many ways. It's why I have a degree in math. You will note that today Meredith will be taking the very heavy data slides. And that's because if you let me start talking about numbers, I won't stop talking about numbers. And last time I did that, everyone hated it. So Meredith will be taking those slides today. But to give you a brief overview, background, I've been a college admissions counselor for about 10 years now. I did my undergrad at Yale University, and I also went to Seoul National University, Seoul Daehakyo. Agenda for the day. The first thing I'll do is give a brief overview of what the different options are, because as Meredith points out, there are lots of options. It can be very confusing, and many of you are juniors. And so you are probably, hopefully, starting to put together your plans of which deadlines and which options you'll be choosing for different schools. So I want to make sure you have the full overview of what those are. Then we'll jump into a little bit of information about what the data actually tells us about how to consider and how to approach those different deadlines. That's where Meredith and I will split things. We'll start talking a little bit more about understanding the data. So not just knowing what the numbers are, but knowing how to use those numbers. We'll be sharing some information about the controversy or the thoughts around why early decision is good, necessary, and in some people's minds, unnecessary and maybe bad. And then we'll be giving some advice on how we suggest you use this information, generally speaking. Emphasis on generally speaking, because we don't know any of you individually yet. We could, but we cannot give you direct specific advice for your exact case on a conversation with 260 of you. So we will be giving very good guiding light overall, and we'll answer some specific questions when we get there in the Q&A in the next steps. But first things first, the various options. So I will point out that I have 3 options here. Each of these options does also exist in 1 or 2 unique manifestations. But generally speaking, early action is the more broad-based and more flexible of the early timelines. This is not early admissions. It's not applying before senior year or any of that. This is just during your senior year application period. It's typically the first available option for filing an application. You typically file it in November. It's not binding. Really, early actions process is you send us your information early. We let you know early. Yay, you get an answer early in the year. You can rest assured if you get into somewhere that You got in somewhere. You're going to a college. Typically, you get those results between December and January. There are some that come earlier. And I have typical deadline written there. I would recommend, you'll get a recording of this, but I would recommend taking a screenshot if you want, because those are pretty standard, but there are some exceptions. Some early action is due on October 15th. I'm looking at you, Clemson. Some early action is due on November 15th. Thank you, Tulane. Some early decision is due on November 15th. Some is due on December 1st. Those are the standard deadlines, but you should check to see if your school has a slight deviation. So early action, that's one. Early decision, that's the other primary early deadline. Again, not early admissions, but just early deadline. Main difference, that one's binding. You can only do one early decision application. If you get in, that's where you're going. That's the general rule. Early action, you could probably do a ton of them. Early decision, you can only do one. If you get in, that's where you're going. Some schools offer one or the other. Some schools don't offer either of them. Some schools offer both. Offering both, not super common, but some schools do it. U Chicago does it. UVA weirdly does it. I say weirdly because it's one of the only public schools I can think of that does it. Regular decision. That's a regular application. Every school with an application has a regular application because that's a standard application. Everywhere has regular decision. It's typically due in January. It's not binding. It's a standard application. You get in where you get in, you go where you go. One note I will make across the board is it doesn't matter which one you apply for between early action and regular decision. Your matriculation deadline is still the standard May deadline. Early decision, if you get in, that's where you're going. Your matriculation deadline is irrelevant. There are a few special cases. Single choice early action, it's a Heights situation. Heights is Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Stanford. They have what's called single choice early action, and that rule is if you apply here early action, you cannot apply anywhere else early unless it's your local state school or because you have to do that to meet a scholarship deadline. Generally, for early action, you can do as many early actions as you want. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Stanford specifically say, if you apply here early, you cannot apply anywhere else early unless it's your local state school or there's a scholarship tied to that date. Restricted early action. It's the Catholic early action, I like to call it. It's just Georgetown and Notre Dame. Their rule is, if you apply here early action, you can do whatever other early action applications you want, but you cannot apply anywhere early decision. So they say, do all the early action you want, but you can't do anywhere ED if you do early action here. And then I just point out, international students should be aware that some schools have different processes or regulations around early action. For example, Caltech, a school near me, but not super close to me because I don't live in Pasadena and it's in Pasadena, but Caltech does have a rule that says if international students apply here early action, they cannot receive financial aid. So there are different schools have some different hoops for international students, so just be aware of that. But that's a good overview of the general timelines for what the options are. I'm going to pass things off to Meredith.
And you are already discovering why, if you are not already frustrated by this phrase, it depends is the single most frustrating phrase for everyone across the entire journey to college. Parents and students, if you're not already frustrated and sick of that, you will be by the time you get there, because all of this, it depends. It depends on so many different pieces. So, all right. So this is the data that Christopher promised I'm going to keep us out of the weeds. So that's why I'm talking about this data tonight. So this information is on the next two slides. It is the same data presented two separate ways on these two slides. This first slide, we're looking at trends, and then the next slide, we're looking at proportions. So that's important to know. And the color coding is the same on the two slides. So this first slide here, on the left-hand side in the green, you're looking at regular decision applications and early applications. And then on the right-hand side, you're looking at regular decision admits and early admits in those different colors. Now, what are we supposed to be looking at here for the trends? What we're noticing with the trends over the last 11 years, so 2012, 2020, and then 2023, you can see that the number of applications to colleges, oh, by the way, these are the numbers from the Ivy League. I forgot to say that, except for Princeton. We don't have the Princeton numbers in here. Some of their data was a little bit funky from these years, so we pulled it out so that we would have an apples to apples comparison year over year across all of this. So the numbers of applications are increasing, and they're increasing at a pretty steep pace, particularly when we're looking at those regular decision applications, which are those numbers in green that you see on the left. The regular decision applications are, it's a pretty big spike that we're seeing. The early round applications, whichever variety of early application it is at the different Ivies, early the action or early decision, they're also increasing, but they're not increasing quite as quickly as overall the total application load is and as the regular decision application. So then when you look on the right-hand side, then we're looking at admits. We're looking at who's been admitted and what that looks like. You notice that the trend is going the other direction. The number of students who have been admitted over the years is decreasing at these schools. But when you look at the numbers there, you can see that the number of students who are being admitted during regular decision is dropping more rapidly than the overall number of students is decreasing. So the takeaway from this, when we're thinking about the trends over the last decade plus, we're seeing that the number of students who are applying to the Ivies is largely skyrocketing, and the number of students who are being admitted in the regular round is largely dropping very quickly because the number of students who are being admitted in the early round is increasing, right? Are you still with me at this point? Hopefully you're still with me. Again, these are trends that we're looking at here. We can move to the next slide then. We now see, again, this is the same information, but now we're looking at the proportions. We're looking at sort of the ratios and the percentages. So the total number of applications, again, remember in green, that total number of applications is really increasing, and the regular decision applications are really increasing more rapidly. But you see that the proportion of early to regular applications isn't really changing that much when it comes to applications. So the percent went from about 11.2% in 2012 to 13.4 and then to 13.8% in 2023. Now, for comparison, I spent 7 years at Cornell. That was, one of my longest stints at a university side. And when I was there, our early decision numbers still pretty much reflected this back at that time. So when students would say, when families would ask in information sessions, what percentage of students are admitted for early decision? Where do your applications come in? At that point, generally speaking, around 10% of our applications came in during the early decision round. And we were committed at that time to not admitting more than a third of our class through early decision. So that was at the time that I was working there, that was the standard that we had. Now, when you're looking then, so again, that top line, that 10%, that hasn't increased that much. It's just under 3% over 11 years. But when you look at the proportions down below, when you look in that admit proportion, you see how quickly that blue proportion is increasing. And that's the percentage of students who are being admitted during the early round. So the students who are being admitted during the early round is skyrocketing. It's gone from 25% to almost 35%. So it's increased by almost 10% over that same period of time. So the number of applications during the early round has only increased about 3%. But the number of admits has increased over almost 10% over that same time period. Now, with a takeaway from this, what this means is that proportion of students, because it's still about 90% of students who are applying during the regular decision round, give or take 85 to 90%, give or take, they are competing for and being considered for an ever decreasing number of seats because the colleges are admitting so many more students during the early round. So instead of you being considered for, one of 1,000 seats, I'm using that as just sort of a generic number, now you are only being considered for, less 35% of that. I should have done that math in advance. Not what, 7,500? No, it's 750, something like that. No, it's 650. Thank you. Christopher's given me an assist on the math there. Thank you, on the fly. But so 90% of the applications now are only be considered for 65% of the seats. 65% of the applications now are only be considered for 65% of the seats. I don't know if hopefully that makes sense by looking at the numbers in two different ways. But the bottom line is the number of applications is increasing. The number of students who are being admitted in the early round is spiking. And so the competition during the regular decision round is getting even more fierce. Did I keep us out of the weeds, Christopher?
I think so. Much better than I did.
Okay.
And I want to start talking a little bit about what yield is and how this factors in. And to a question I see in the chat, but I will remind everyone, put your questions in the Q&A, not the chat if possible. But the question I see in the chat is about yield. And the answer I will give to that is yes and no. It is in part because schools are focused on better yield, but it's also because yield has gone up all on its own. So first off, I'll explain what yield is. Yield is the proportion of students who are accepted, who actually decide to say yes and actually go to that school. Keep in mind, students typically apply to multiple schools. We recommend you apply to multiple schools. We don't recommend you apply to 40 schools. That's annoying. And not just because it's a lot of work, it's because it's irresponsible and vaguely unethical. We do not recommend that students apply to every school they can imagine, but you should have a list of good fit schools that you apply to. You should cover your bases. You should have backup options. You should have multiple targets, etc. But knock on wood, you don't only get into one school, you have options. And if you get into 6 schools that you love, you only go to one of them. So you turn down the other 5. The other 5 that you turn down, they lose yield. So schools are very focused on not just admitting kids who are qualified, but admitting kids who are good fits and kids that they think will actually show up on campus, because they don't want to just admit kids who won't show up. So on one side, yes, schools being much more focused on admitting the kids who actually demonstrate that they are likely to show up on campus and are likely to succeed at that school, because the kid who will do well at Dartmouth is not necessarily the kid who will do well at Columbia. One is in Hanover, New Hampshire, in the middle of absolutely nowhere, and one is in Manhattan. Those are different students for the most part. So they're focused on that. And then on the other side, yield at a lot of the very, very selective schools has gone up on its own, which means in 2010, not to pick on Cornell, it's just the data it's the data I most recently looked at. But in 2010, Cornell had an overall yield of about 35%, 36%. So about 1/3 of the kids who were admitted actually showed up. So it meant that on the whole, Cornell had to admit about 3 kids for every 1 spot they actually had available. That has gone up. Cornell's current yield sits at about 60%, which means Cornell has to admit fewer than 2 students for every 1 spot, which is why they have cut a large number of the students they admit overall. Because if Cornell admitted the same number of kids they were admitting in 2010, they would have several thousand kids too many. So they are cutting that number because a higher percentage of the students who get in have started to show up. So they've had to keep their number of admits falling so that they can maintain the size of their actual campus population. That's the thing. These schools, Yale has space for about 1,200 freshmen a year. It doesn't matter how many people apply. Yale has space for about 1,200 freshmen a year. And last year is a great example. Last year, Yale over-enrolled by about 100 kids. About 100 kids more than Yale planned for showed up. And when asked how the university would respond, Dean Lewis said point blank verbatim, it's in the newspaper, we'll just admit fewer students for the next 4 years. Because Yale has space on campus for a specific number of students. If they get more, they have to accommodate. There are already juniors living on campus at Yale, so they account for that. So I've already given a little bit of information about Cornell's number, but so it's like Cornell's RD admits and early admits from 2010 to 2023, or actually this is the Ivy League number. Sorry, this is Cornell's number. This is Cornell's number, just so you can see a demonstration of it. But Cornell's, their total number of admits have gone from almost 7,000 to about 5,000. They've cut about 2,000 kids. It's worth noting that Cornell actually increased the number of students on campus during that period. They built another dorm, they added more space, But even with adding more space, they've had to decrease the number of kids getting in because their yield has gone up. And at that same time, their number of early decision admits has also increased. And that's largely because it helps them manage it helps them manage their student population. Just for quick data, I promise I wouldn't get too deep into it, but in 2010, Cornell admitted about 1,200 kids early decision. In 2021, that was 1,900 kids. And then it started falling back because Meredith mentioned that commitment to only having a third of their students be early decision. There was a while where Cornell had exceeded that by quite a bit. And so in 2021, they were admitting 1,900 kids early decision. And then it fell to about 1,800 in 2022, about 1,700 in 2023. But the RD number, the regular decision number for Cornell, was 5,500 in 2010. And then it dropped to about 4,000 in 2021. So in 11 years, it dropped 1,500. And then between 2021 and 2022, it dropped from 4,000 to 3,100. And then between 2022 and 2023, it dropped to 3,300. So in 2023, 1,700 ED, 3,300 RD. So again, yield explains a lot of that. Their yield was like a higher percentage of the students who get in show up, they have to decrease the number so they can maintain their number of students. So I've already explained part of that. But I want to give an explanation of why colleges have early decision. So one person mentioned earlier, like, is it about yield? In some ways, yes. If a student gets in ED, you get in, that's where you go, that's guaranteed yield. It does increase their yield number because the yield that they share is the overall yield. It's not the regular decision yield, it's not the ED yield, it's overall yield. And so a greater number of ED students, ED for early decision, sorry, but a greater number of ED students does produce a higher overall yield. But there are a couple of reasons other than yield. So I will give the colleges some credit. Part of the reason that colleges have ED is it's helpful for their budget. And this is especially true if we look outside of just the Ivy League, where the budget is largely unlimited. But it's very helpful for colleges' budgets because students who are admitted early decision they're locked in, which also means that students who are getting financial aid who are admitted early decision, that is a firm way to account for. We know what percentage of our financial aid budget has been used. Because kids who are admitted regular decision or even early action, it's a little bit more up in the air. Colleges are left juggling. We don't know how many of our high need financial aid students will actually be coming. So we don't know what, like, we may have overestimated it, we may have underestimated it, we may not have admitted enough. And so even for schools who are, it's a somewhat ableist phrase, but need blind. Schools that are need blind are schools that don't check a family's finances during the admissions process, but they're not deliberately admitting students who need financial aid during ED, though there are some other tools that they can use for geographics and knowing where there's lower socioeconomic status, et cetera. But when they get their ED numbers, they're then able to say, great, we admitted half of our class, and we have an exact measure of what our financial aid budget remains. So instead of gambling with 100% of our financial aid budget, we're gambling with half of it when we do our regular decision admits where our yield is questionable. It's also helpful for their enrollment management. I mentioned these schools know how many spaces they have available on campus. They need as much control as possible over the number of students who enroll. And the more students that are left to chance, the more their enrollment is left to chance. And getting back to that, why applying to 40 schools is irresponsible and borderline unethical. The more students continue to apply to every school whose name they know, the more colleges are left completely without a way to manage their enrollment, aside from admitting fewer students and putting more kids in early decision. And then on the other side, there's it helps you capture talent early. It helps you lock in that amazing student earlier so that they don't choose somewhere else. And I will also clarify that those are the reasons that early decision has been around and why it's been such a priority for a very long time. But that's not necessarily going to be true everywhere moving forward. That budget is true. Some schools use it for their diversity measure in order for them to target low SES or diverse areas, but some of those things will continue, some of them won't, and Meredith is going to get into some of that data.
Yeah, and before I jump into this, I just wanted to follow up one comment on some of what Christopher was saying. You know, the colleges have very, very sophisticated yield models that they use. And one of the things that has been an effect of COVID and all of the other pieces that have gone into that is those yield models have been completely shattered. The level of predictability of who is going to yield at a college is now at an all-time low. Trying to figure out like who is likely to come and who isn't is really incredibly difficult at this point. It's never been an exact science. They got a pretty good read on it at most colleges most years. And you know, Christopher was talking about the stuff with Cornell in 2010. I was still there in 2010, and so I was still reading. I was a part of building that class through 2012, and so there was sort of this slow creep, and we were seeing sort of that spike in applications starting around the time I left, and starting the creep in early decision as I was leaving there. One other thing that the early decision helps colleges to manage that has gone without saying, but maybe shouldn't go without saying is, the colleges, no matter what they say about not caring about the rankings, they care about the rankings. And getting the students locked in during early decision also helps them manage the stats that will go into the US News and World Report rankings, because it is another way of sort of locking in, that the top kids or whatever they see as being the top kids. So that's, I just wanted to add that also, having sat in that office and going, okay, now we're through that early decision. We know what the statistical breakdown is of this group where they're going to yield at 100%. Now we can build out the rest of the class, and we know sort of the statistical profile we need to aim for in order to have what we think of as being a well-rounded class that's going to sort of hit the benchmarks that we're going to need in order for, the rankings and to be palatable for the people who care about that kind of thing. So that's sort of one of the sort of the dirty little secrets of college admissions, is some of that sort of the seedy underbelly kinds of things. When we're talking about what is going to be happening as we're moving forward with early decision, it is worth noting that some of the colleges are starting to shift their behavior around the early decision, in part because of the Supreme Court decision, or in large part because of it, because shifting the way that they make decisions around early decision is one of the ways that they can shape the class, demographically. The early decision, because you are basically promising to come when you submit your application, the financial element of it is a little bit less predictable on the family side. So one of the downsides is that, if your family finances aren't very certain, early decisions sometimes can be a question mark for you. And so, if a college is looking to admit students of greater socioeconomic diversity, being able to, again, as Christopher said, knowing what the aid budget is, they're able to do that, but they also know that the students who are going to need a lot of aid may not be applying during early decision. So if they want a socioeconomically diverse class, they are going to need to, admit students, sort of in a different pattern, if you will. Cornell in particular, there actually was, and I swear this is not pick on Cornell night, but they actually, this fall, part of the way into the application season. So there was a closed door conversation that happened with their trustees that the student newspaper actually broke in, I think it was in November, and reported on it publicly. The university hadn't announced it publicly. I don't think it was a secret, but they didn't announce it publicly before the application deadline. And they decided, trustees and the enrollment management folks at Cornell decided deliberately to decrease the number of students that they were admitting during early decision, explicitly and deliberately made that decision. And we did see that reflected this year. And we're also seeing that at other places as well. So for example, this year with Harvard, there was a new, over the last couple of years, they've got a new person in charge of admissions there, essentially. The former person who is the director there took their early admit numbers from just over 700 to over 1,000 between 2012 and 2018. So sort of in the first half of that window of time that we were looking at with those different graphs. But when that new director took over after that, the number has then fallen steadily, just a little bit each year. It fell, so it had started at 700 over that time, and now it's back below 700 now. So it's sort of decreased around 50 a year, give or take 50 a year over the last few years. So again, they're deliberately decreasing those numbers. And I will say, sometimes a change in leadership in an admissions office and an enrollment management, sort of the entire sort of division, does create these changes with different thoughts as well. So we've got Cornell and Harvard who are both deliberately decreasing their emphasis and their prioritization of early admits. And then at the same time, you have places like Swarthmore and other small liberal arts colleges who really deliberately use early decision as one of the tools to guide their diversity missions. And as Christopher was saying, to sort of track their financial aid budgets to make sure that they're not overspending on financial aid. And they're still probably going to be utilizing early decision in similar-ish kinds of ways moving forward. We may see some small changes, but we're probably not going to see dramatic changes from those colleges. So generally speaking, this year across the other Ivies, so with Yale and with Harvard and with Brown, generally speaking, we ended up seeing, the numbers vary a little bit in terms of the percentage of students who were admitted, early versus regular, and what their overall admit rates are. But we found across those that it seems like most of them are sticking to sort of that, third of the class. They were all sort of right around 35% overall of early action or early decision admissions this year. So they're back to sort of sticking to that 30-ish% where it had been sort of creeping up over the last few years. So let's talk a little bit now about the strategy to employ. And there have been some questions that have come in, sort of seen them pass through in the chat box. And again, please do put your questions in the Q&A because that chat box scrolls pretty quickly. There have been some questions about, and I actually saw one specifically where the question was, is there ever a time when it actually benefits you to apply regular decision versus early? And the answer is yes, sometimes that is the case. So again, you remember earlier when I sort of made the comment about it depends and how much you'll come to hate that phrase if you don't already. Well, here we are. It depends. So one of the things that goes along with the college, the journey to college, and this also sort of alludes to something that Anna said at the very outset. Kevin, the CollegeWise founder, that's really one of the founding principles, is to increase the joy and decrease the stress of the journey to college, because it has gotten really stressful. But one of the other pieces that goes along with this is that the journey to college, it is both a pragmatic choice for a student and for a family, as well as an emotional choice. And especially when it comes to the student, for students, this is a lot of times, this is the first time students who are 17, 18, 19 have made such a massive life-changing decision. And it can be scary. It can be difficult. And even if you are looking at it, specifically individually as a family on the pragmatic side of things, whatever your family's priorities are, whether it's the purely financial side of it, whether you as a family really prioritize having a certain name brand attached to the degree that your student earns, whatever that priority is, that can be the pragmatic side of the decision. But ultimately, there is an emotional element both to the decision, and then also once the student gets to the college, they have to actually do college. So they actually have to be at a place where they can be happy and thrive. Most of my 25 plus years in higher education has been working in admissions and advising and college counseling. But part of that time is advising. I did spend 5 years at Purdue working in academic advising as well as recruiting. And one of the things that you see when students are at a campus where they're not happy, I used to talk about it being like a time-lapse camera. If you've ever remember those nature films where they sort of show the seed going from like miniature to full bloom, or a seed that's not really healthy, not really blooming and thriving. That's sort of a reflection of the emotional side of the decision. If a student ends up making a choice based on a pure pragmatism, but ignores the emotional piece of it, they might end up on a college campus where they're not going to thrive as well. They might be okay, but they may not thrive as well. So it can be difficult to sort of balance the two pieces of it. I'm not saying that you should ignore the pragmatism, I'm not saying that either. But when it comes to making the decision around an early application, these two forces really sort of compete with each other in a lot of ways. So how do you think about the strategy, knowing that there is an emotional component of this as well? And I will say that we talk about this a lot with our students. Really, really, all of the college-wise counselors, we spend a ton of time sort of really thinking through all of the nuance of this. And the challenge with early decision, or with some of this, well, it's more the early decision because it is binding. There's an element of FOMO that comes up for students sometimes. Even if pragmatically speaking and strategically speaking, it makes more sense for you to apply early decision to a college, because as many of you have kind of gleaned, applying early decision often, although not always, increases your chances of being admitted to that college and increases your chances pretty substantially based on the trends we've seen over the last few years. But when I have conversations with students about, let's look at the purely pragmatic part of it, the most common response I get from students is, but I want to know how it would turn out at the other colleges. I want to know whether or not I would get in at these other places that I love. And if they do early decision, they don't get to find out. They really don't. Because they're applying early decision, they're promising Brown or Dartmouth or Cornell or Columbia. They're promising them, like, I will come if you say yes to me. The students don't get to wait and hear back from every other place. You're making the promise already that that's where you're going. And you're also promising you're going to withdraw all of your other applications. So there is an emotional element to that with students. And we need to make sure that we don't ignore that piece of it. And then when it comes specifically to sort of thinking about on an individual level strategically, when might it make more sense for a student to consider waiting for a regular decision versus an early round? When is it strategically better? And again, it depends. There's a lot of nuance. It's so many different layers and levels of this. But the kinds of conversations we typically have with students are around, are you going to be your best candidate, whatever that looks like for you, at the end of your junior year? If you are somebody who's been rocking it out with all A's and all fives and all 800s all over the board, if you're somebody who really is at the top of your game at the end of your junior year, you're a student where early decision may very well make sense for you, because you're already going to be presenting your best student applicant self at that point. If you're a student where maybe there's been some softness along the way, maybe you struggled a little bit junior year, or maybe you struggled a little bit in 9th grade or in 10th grade. Maybe your grades are a little bit messier, and then maybe you don't have that perfect transcript. Those are students where, seriously considering, is early a smart choice for you? For a student who struggled earlier on, early decision might actually be a better choice, because you can show them that you've been doing well and they lock you in. You're a sure thing then. An early decision school may be like, you know what? We know the student can handle it based on their current trajectory. We're confident they can handle it. It's a good thing they applied early decision, though, because we'll say yes to them now, but we would have said no in regular decision. We actually have those kinds of conversations sometimes in committee where we would make decisions like that. And then there's some students where, applying early decision might actually lock them in a way that doesn't necessarily serve them. I actually worked with 2 students this year who are probably among the strongest students I've worked with in my 11 years at college-wise. Just both absolutely spectacularly bright, have just done really fantastically interesting things. And with both of them, I had conversations about, like, okay, let's talk about the pragmatic piece, and then let's talk about the emotional piece. And with both of them, pragmatically speaking, their best bet for getting the thing that they most wanted was committing early decision to a college. But for both of them, the emotional piece, and they also were both looking internationally as well. So they didn't want to close off the international options. So for both of them, they understood it was a calculated risk, and both of them decided not to apply early decision anywhere. And for both of them, it actually paid off. It doesn't always work that way, though. I had another student a couple of years ago who said, my top choices are MIT and Penn. I want to go to MIT, but Penn's my second choice. And I'm like, great, you should apply to Penn early decision. And he had some messiness in his transcript in 9th grade. and a little bit in 10th grade as well. And he said, but if I could get into MIT. And I said, you're not going to get into MIT. I've never seen a student with grades like yours in 9th and 10th grade get into MIT ever. He said, but if I could get in. And I said, I understand what you're saying, but early decision to Penn is your best chance of getting one of your top 2 choices. And he decided not to. And he got into neither of them. And so he later on came back and said, you know, I wish that I made that choice and applied early decision to Penn. And I said, yeah, that's hard. So, and again, that's the emotional versus the pragmatic piece. And that's why we spend so much time having these conversations with our students. There is no universal strategy around that, but hopefully you understand how in some cases, maybe there's a strategic leverage. And at a minimum, you sort of understand why this seems like the numbers are so like wackadoo all over the place with the skyrocketing applications and the plummeting admit rates. You sort of have a little bit of a sense of how and why that's happening within this realm of schools in particular. And with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Anna.
Thank you, Meredith. Thank you, Christopher. We've had so many questions come through, and I'm excited to dive deeper into those. But as always, CollegeWise is really here to help families enjoy their college application journey. And so if your family is interested in having conversations with us and learning more about our programs, I'm going to speak a little bit more about how we offer support to families. Now, all of our programs are personalized to the student. There's no 2 students that are alike. So we do always look at the student's needs first and foremost. But from the application side of things, we help our students with college research, list building, identifying what schools are the best fit for them. And then we talk about the application timeline. So as Meredith had mentioned, sometimes applying early just is not feasible for students. Sometimes financial aid needs to be taken into consideration. And so these are conversations that we have with families. And it definitely puts families at ease knowing that there is an expert like Meredith or Christopher, who have so many years of experience going through this application process with former students to really help guide them in the right direction. We also work with our students on essay writing development. For the students that are on this call, I will be the first to say you cannot escape essays, not in college, not in the college application process. So it is a pretty big component of the work that we do here. And we do have an in-house essay review team that works with students on polishing some of those essays. And then finally, academics really serve as one of the first touch points for colleges to determine if a student is academically qualified to attend that college. So we do have an in-house tutoring department that works with students on AP as well as standardized testing, tutoring, and test prep. So, and as Christopher mentioned, no, you cannot use ChatGPT. So another reason to consider CollegeWise. And as always, I am going to launch our final poll of the evening. Again, if you are interested in working with us, I'd love for all of you to start answering the question up on the screen. So letting us know if you are interested, would like some more information on our programs and pricing, or if you're already working with CollegeWise. So we'd love to know from you. In addition to that, we do often get a large uptick in families who want to start working with us. And if you are interested in booking your time now, I have dropped a link in our chat as well. So feel free to skip the post-webinar rush and schedule a meeting with us directly. So this is a free consultation with our program advisors, and you'll be able to learn more about our programs and pricing there as well. So I'll leave that poll up for another minute or so. Let's head on to the next slide. We did have some questions come through about the recording. So again, the session is being recorded and you will all receive a copy of the recording. If you were not able to actually respond to our poll, or let's say you are looking back at this a few days from now, feel free to scan the QR code to set up that intro meeting with us as well. So that is available to all of you. Now, before I head into the Q&A, I do want to pass the mic back to Christopher and Meredith. Are there any questions that you want to answer right away that you think are very important?
So I see a couple about the process of applying early and then applying regular again. And just to get this through, because it's a lot of these, there are there are three different outcomes if you apply early. There's accepted, in which case we all cheer. There is denied, in which case we support the student and we make sure they know that that is not a comment on who they are as a person or what their value is. And then there's the usually quite confusing one called deferred. Defer means that you are not admitted or denied. You are actually being told to wait until the next cycle. So deferral means that you are being just put into the regular decision pool and you will get an answer there. You can't reapply. You are pushed into the next application pool. You can decide that you don't want to be part of it and you can withdraw from the admissions process. But if you are denied during early action or early decision, you cannot reapply. That is the final answer. You cannot reapply for that same year. If you are denied, that is your final answer for the year. You could, of course, reapply the following year, but you cannot reapply for that same entry. And to that point, I have a student who currently has a degree as well, who applied a second year because he applied a year before he worked with me and didn't get in. And so he couldn't reapply that year. So he came to me later and reapplied. So can't reapply that year, but you can apply later.
Awesome. And Meredith, was there any question that you wanted to answer?
Yeah, I'm going to tackle one. There's someone who asked about, is there a bias once, or could there be a bias once an early action student is deferred for regular decision? And then are there any stats on how many students deferred in early action were accepted in regular decision? So that second one is, it depends. For example, Harvard defers almost everybody that they don't accept in early. So getting a deferral from Harvard from early to regular decision is effectively meaningless. Whereas Stanford defers only a tiny handful from early to regular decision. And so if you get a deferral from Stanford from early to regular, that is actually meaningful in that case. So, and then, beyond that, there's a lot of others in between at all different levels of selectivity for colleges. In terms of, is there a bias? Colleges work very hard not to have bias when they review applications. However, one thing I will say is, when I was talking earlier about, if you are your best student self at the end of the 6th semester, then an early application could be advantageous. For a student where maybe they're not going to be their best student self, they're maybe not quite ready to be their best applicant self when they're submitting an application for a November 1st deadline, that's a student where the power of the first impression could work against them. And that's a student where maybe an early application might not be to their advantage. And it's not that there would be a bias against them, but like if it comes across and there's sort of that like, ooh, there's something not right about this. Ooh, they're not quite what we're hoping for. They're not quite strong enough. Or, wow, this is a student, where there's something else going on. That could subconsciously work against them as an applicant. Not consciously, but we're human and admissions officers are human. And so that, first impressions absolutely make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Meredith. Christopher, we've had many questions come through about financial aid. And of course, when it comes to applying early, that is a big concern for families. So do you want to chat a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and I'm going to try and capture the 27 questions I saw both in the Q&A and in the chat. First off, are students who apply early action or early decision eligible for financial aid? Yes, asterisk. My asterisk is, again, as I mentioned for Caltech, Caltech says international students who apply early, no, you're not eligible for financial aid. So generally speaking, yes, if you apply early, you are still eligible for all of the financial aid. And many schools actually have financial aid or have scholarships that are specifically tied to early action. So great example here in California, USC, University of Southern California. If you don't apply by the early action deadline, you are not eligible for the biggest chunk of merit scholarships at USC. It's early action, not decision, so it's not binding, but you have to apply early action to be eligible for those scholarships. And that's why it's one of those exceptions to the single choice early action at HYPES, HYPES. And then early decision, typically there aren't scholarships that are tied to early decision, but if you apply for early decision, you are still fully eligible for financial aid, as long as they didn't say you weren't specifically on that application. And the thing we say is families, you sign an ED agreement. You should read the financial aid information on the website. You should see if they need demonstrated need. Keep in mind that the demonstrated need that the colleges measure, it's what they and the FAFSA determine as your need. It's not the amount of money that you want. It's the amount of money that the application determines they should be supplying you. There's often some disagreement there, but there's a literal federal form. It was just redone. The redoing of it was chaos, but typically the FAFSA is filed in, we recommend October or November. This year's a weird aberration. Typically you can file your FAFSA in October, November. So if you do early decision, you typically, as long as you do it on time, you get your financial aid information with your decision. If what you see is wildly different from what was on the estimated cost calculator and everything like that, you have some ground to argue with the admissions office and potentially to back out of early decision if it is wildly different from what everything that they provided communicated it should have been for you. But if you make $350,000 a year and they tell you that you're expected to pay full price, that makes sense. You would have seen that on the estimated cost calculator. You do not have the grounds necessarily to back out of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Meredith, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
I think the only two things I would add is when I was at Cornell, when we would answer that question, you know, if a student was admitted during early decision and, you know, got a financial aid package that was just not workable for the family, we expected families to make a good faith effort to work with the financial aid office to make it work, to find a way to bridge the gap. And then if everybody did, and it still wasn't workable, then we would, you know, let them out of their early decision agreement. But if that happens, you don't get to keep that seat. Like, that's the other thing, is if you're saying no, you have to give that seat up. You don't get to come back around later and say, hey, actually, we didn't get more aid from anybody else. We still want to come back here again. That's one of those sort of little hidden caveats sometimes. And the other piece that I will say is, I mean, it's not a caveat, but I don't think that families, that piece doesn't always register with families. The other piece is, you know, if you as a family really want to comparison shop price-wise, totally understand. Early decision is probably not the best option for you because you don't get to sort of weigh your financial options, college versus college versus college. And so that also is one of the challenges with early decision. Christopher referenced the net price calculators as one of the options. I would say that they're probably exceptionally unpredictable this year. There's a federal law that says all colleges have to have a net price calculator on their website, basically sort of estimating what you as an individual family would get in terms of aid and would be paying out of pocket. Given everything that's going on with the FAFSA, Christopher referenced, they're redoing it this year, and it's been really very exceptionally messy. We'll just put it that way. That's a very polite response. But I would say that given how all the calculations are happening, I would not trust a net price calculator this year. I would reach out to the financial aid office and sort of say, hey, is there a way we can figure this out? There are some places that will do like an early financial aid estimate for possible early decision students.
Yeah, amazing. We have time for one last question, but before I pass the mic back to Christopher, I already taken a look, and we've had a few families that have scheduled a free consultation with us. So I do encourage all of you to schedule your free consultation if you haven't already. Of course, the deadlines we are discussing today are in November. And November seems like a long time away, but time has a weird way of creeping up on us when we least expect it. And so we always recommend that families have these conversations as early as possible, just to give you and your family enough time to weigh all of your options and pave a successful pathway. So I popped that link back there for those of you who are interested. Now, Christopher, back to you with acceptance rates.
So there were a lot of questions about what's the difference in acceptance rate for ED or early action versus RD. And one of our favorite answers, it depends, but a lot of this information could be found online. Some of this there were also questions about like where we get the data from. It's lots of data mining. We have teams of nerds. When I published that paper, I had 4 people supporting me on data research. So it's not publicly available. You need a nerd to find it for you. But for acceptance rates, some schools do have massive admissions benefits for applying early action. So I have a quick list here. Boston University, 13% regular decision acceptance rate, 25% early decision acceptance rate. Dartmouth College, 4.9% regular decision acceptance rate, 21.3% early decision acceptance rate. This is the class of 2026, by the way, not the class that just came out. I have those numbers, but I'm not giving them to you, just because I forgot to load them up. Northwestern University, 5.6% regular acceptance rate, 22.1% early decision acceptance rate. Tulane University, 7.9% regular decision acceptance rate, 67.9% early decision acceptance rate. Tulane loves to advertise that they have roughly a 17% acceptance rate. That's because they have a 68% ED acceptance rate, so there are no spaces left for regular decision. So at some schools, it's a massive difference. At some schools, it's a small difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Christopher. We are at time. But of course, as always, we are always here to help. And I always like to say there is something for everyone at CollegeWise. And thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Christopher, Meredith, you've shared a ton of information that was helpful for all the families who are tuned in. But as always, CollegeWise hosts weekly webinars. So we do hope to see you at our future events as well. So Christopher, one last thing from you.
For the questions about how I did my statistics, I did them accurately. I have a degree in mathematics. Yes, I did the statistics properly.
Yes, we need to leave off on that note. Absolutely. Well, thank you all again so much. I'm wishing you all a wonderful evening, and we hope to see you at our future events. So take care. Thank you.